Hello, welcome to Suit Up the Podcast. I am your host and metaphorical haberdasher, Terrence Lehue. Today we are joined on the show by Drew Hannush from the Whiskey Lore podcast. We're going to talk all about how Drew became involved in a travel lifestyle, his interest in whiskey, and some of his favorite whiskey stories. So stay tuned for this incredible interview with Drew Hannush. Drew Hannush, welcome to Suit Up the Podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing good. Great to talk with you and see another person wearing a tie and a suit.
I know. Thank you. I'm very impressed.
I have no suits, but it's South Carolina. It's about 100 degrees outside, so it's not suit weather for me.
And you know what? God bless you. I don't know how. Like when I see shows like Matlock, when he's in Atlanta, and it's like heat of summer, and he's wearing like that cream suit. I'm like, even light colors. I don't know how you try to do this. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I was just watching Better Call Saul, and he's always wearing a tie and a suit. Of course, the most bizarre color combinations, which somehow work for him. I don't know how they work for him, but he's in New Mexico, and I'm thinking it's got to be hot. I never see those guys sweat. They must have.
It was just in New Mexico. It's ridiculous. It was a nightmare. So this interview is actually a really fun one because we kind of do the Venn diagram of my interests, because not only do you have a podcast about whiskey, 2 podcasts about whiskey, you have published a book on bourbon, but you are also a James Bond fan.
Yes. James Bond got me to all of this.
Which is so awesome. Would you mind telling us about how James Bond helped lead to where you are today?
Okay. So it was around 2016 or so that I had a web design business. And so I had read a book called The 4-Hour Workweek, and I was just starting to work through trying to figure out how to optimize my business so I would have more free time. And at the same time, I had a friend of mine who's a huge James Bond fan. And I got to be honest, at the time that we were chatting back and forth, then I like the Daniel Craig movies. Oddly, I like the one of the Timothy Dalton movies. The other one I've grown to sort of appreciate.
Wait, which one? I have to ask.
So the one I love is Living Daylights.
Oh, and it's a gorgeous one. So License to Kill is the one that's grown on you.
License to Kill is starting to grow on me. And the reason is because I started reading the books and I realized that parts of that come out of Live and Let Die, the book. And so it helped me appreciate that even though it comes out like a Miami Vice episode, it still has some elements in there, and it was trying to ratchet up. It did what Daniel Craig did in Casino Royale, but doing it right after campy Roger Moore, I think was just bad timing, really. Yeah. So, but I really wasn't much into the Pierce Brosnans. I love the Pierce Brosnans, but that was because I was a Remington Steele fan.
Oh yeah.
And so I just moved over from Remington Steele into the Pierce Brosnan stuff.
There's only like a delta of 5 degrees difference between him as Remington Steele and him as Bond.
Yeah. He was more of a Cary Grant kind of a figure rather than being the super spy. He fumbled into success more than being the intelligent guy that could pull everything off. So that's how I got into James Bond, but I was a very casual fan until a friend of mine gave me a audio series called How to Live the James Bond Lifestyle.
Ooh.
And this is a guy, Paul Cariazzi. I've had him on my Travel Feels Life podcast, which was the first podcast that I started working on. And we talked for 3 hours, just filling in all the gaps from his book series or from his audio series, because this was fascinating. It was teaching you life skills and teaching you how to understand that James Bond is a persona and how to build that persona around yourself and become elements of it, but also figure out who you are at the same time and push your own personality into it as well. And of course, he would talk about how to meet women, how to treat women, that sort of thing. He would teach you about. He liked to teach about craps. He goes through the whole thing of how to play craps. Me, I became a Baccarat fan. So I was like,
which is classic Fleming.
Yes.
Chef's kiss.
Yes. But was it Chem de Fleur, I think is the name of the actual game that he played, which is not the same thing that you will play when you go to Vegas. If you go to Vegas, you're playing mini Baccarat, which is basically they don't pass the shoe around.
Yeah.
Which is the main difference. So I've been to Monte Carlo. I chickened out in going to sit because I was like, I don't know if I'm quite ready for this yet. But anyway, so I like to move my conversation off into tangents every once in a while. But basically what happened was I got into this lifestyle and it changed my focus from being somebody who was just satisfied with where I was at to being somebody who said, hey, it's okay to wear a suit. I was, as a web designer, I was always commented on as the one web designer who wore a tie. But that was because I loved wearing a tie. I sense a measure of respect for my client in that I took the time to dress up to go to meet them.
Absolutely.
And so that's a big piece of it. And so, it was integrating all these things that I really wanted in my life. And one of the pieces of that was travel. I have, since I was a kid, my dad used to write books on presidents. And so we would go and travel all over the country, going to libraries and presidents' homes and whatever. And so we would go to all these different places. And so I got a love for history and I got a love for travel out of all of that. And so what I ended up doing was I said, why don't I learn how to live a travel lifestyle? And the way to learn how to do this would be, let me go to and see if I can travel on my own. And if I can keep my costs down, travel light, but do something really interesting. So I started up a blog and I was talking about some of the different places that I was going or that I had been. And I was building out a new office for my web design company. And I had to put about $14,000 on this credit card for the build out of the office. Well, I ended up getting a bunch of bonus points for that. And so I turned that into a free ticket to Paris. And so I said, okay, I learned French in school. I've always had a fascination with French culture. Maybe I will go to France. Well, I am a planner and I had planned 16 days in Paris, but I don't sit still. So that would just be boring to me. Yeah. So I said, okay, you know what? I need to be a little bit more creative. So I was into this James Bond lifestyle. I'm watching all of these movies for the second and third time now. And I thought, why don't I research these movies and find out all the places that James Bond went in Europe? And I will build a trip around going to all of these different locations. And so I went through all, 24 movies at that time, wrote all the places down. My favorite Bond movie is Casino Royale. So
excellent selection.
Yes. And I definitely wanted to go to those locations, but when you watch the movie, it says Montenegro. So I went, okay, well, maybe I'm not, that's kind of off the beaten path. But then as I started researching, I found out that it was actually almost completely filmed in the Czech Republic. And so the hotel, the casino, of course, part of that was on stage at Pinewood Studios, but the outside and the scene when he's asking Vesper for more money is actually on the porch of a building in Karlovy Vary, Czech Republic, and so which is just a short walk over from the hotel. So I started looking it up, and I said, "Oh, okay. Look, a lot of filming locations in Prague." Most of that film was filmed in Karlovy Vary, so I can go find all the little spots, and I can even go to a little place to go shoot a Walther PPK. I'm not really a gun guy, but I was like, you know what? I got to do it.
Might as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so I planned all of that out and went to a lot of those locations, was taking pictures of all the places that I was going to. Even the Miami scene at the airport takes place at the Prague airport.
Oh, really?
Yes. And at the transportation department and when you see them go into the museum, that museum is the transportation department for the Czech Republic.
Oh,
and
cool.
They just put all these taxi cabs and everything. They just basically mocked them up to look like you were in Miami. But I have pictures of me standing outside of the transportation department of the Czech Republic, and it is that building. Just imagine a banner hanging across it saying Body Worlds on it.
Yeah.
So so that was fun. And I tried to ride the Vesper train, when he is talking to, but
I'm the money.
Yes,
every penny
exactly.
of it.
Yes, that's one of my favorite scenes from that.
Absolutely amazing.
From that film. So I wanted to see that. Well, I didn't quite get to do that, but I did ride the train in and had all the experiences there. I went down to Italy. I went to where my favorite Roger Moore film was filmed, For Your Eyes Only. The
classic.
Cortina, which is where the Olympics were held. And of course, you can see the ski lift and the hotel he stayed in and all that sort of stuff. So I went to all of those different places and went to Monte Carlo and walked through and sat outside having a coffee, watching the Lamborghinis go by and Bentleys and all the rest. So I was absorbing the lifestyle at that point. And so I did a blog post about it, really enjoyed posting all of that information and kind of sharing with people how to do that and where to find those locations and all that sort of stuff. And then when I got back home, I was like, well, I really should find another theme trip to do. And maybe I'll do one here in the US. And so my friends and I had just started experimenting with whiskey. And I had not had whiskey in 20 years because I had a bad experience with Jack Daniels. And because of that, I couldn't smell whiskey for the longest time. Just the smell of it would set the gag reflex off. So a friend started working me back in by getting me to Scotch. He said, Scotch is going to taste a little different. It's not going to have the same smells to it. Maybe you can kind of get into it. And so then a friend of mine who was part of that started bringing in some bourbons. And we were all sitting around talking like we knew what we were talking about, but none of us really did have a clue. And
so it's like every group of guys getting together.
Exactly. We're all experts, but in reality, we're all full of it. So I was like, I don't like being in this position. I like to talk about things that I understand. And so maybe I should just do my next theme trip by going to Kentucky. So that's what I did. I was like, home of whiskey, it's got to be Kentucky. So I'm going to go up to Kentucky and I'm going to plan out this trip. And I ended up going to 19 distilleries in 8 days.
Wow.
And I video blogged.
Hauling.
Yes. And I video blogged the whole thing because I wanted people to be able to understand the journey I went through and what I learned along the way by going to all of these different distilleries. And so I was doing the travel lifestyle podcast at that time, but I heard so many great whiskey stories that I was like, the history lover in me wants to tell these stories. And I'm also hearing a lot of conflicting information, even in the distilleries. And so I want to research those things and then be able to tell the true story behind them, Mythbuster or and storyteller all in one. And so that's when I started doing the Whiskey Lore Stories podcast, which was me doing dramatizations of events and also giving the research side of history, but also helping people learn how to taste whiskey. And I did a whole series, a whole episode on the tongue map. I don't know if you remember the tongue map from school.
No.
So the tongue map says that you taste sweet on the tip of your tongue.
Okay.
You taste sour and salty on the sides of your tongue, and you taste bitter in the back of your tongue. And so this was put into every school kids book when they were learning in their science book. And so I hear at every distillery I go to this same story told over and over. And I've always kind of thought, it just doesn't ring right to me. So I did the research on it and come to find out you actually you taste everything all over your tongue. And the researcher who had come up with, was a German researcher, had come up with this chart and showed that he had done a Q-tip test around his tongue to find where flavor impact was. And so this was his experience off of his tongue. And the one thing he didn't do, the whole book was written in German, the one thing that he didn't do was put on the side of the graph a level of measurement. So when a Harvard professor came in and decided to do a revision write-up of this, apparently he didn't read the German text. And he came up with a similar graph that shows that we taste sweet on the front. We taste, it's showing these high impacts of where these flavors come in on your tongue. And it's all not true, but it got translated into this tongue diagram that everybody has seen since then. And so we all trumpet that. And you hear it when you're on whiskey tours, they'll say, well, when you're on the finish of the whiskey, you'll get the bitter. That's when that will come in. It's not true. But your tongue does taste different things in different areas. And it's important to learn how your senses work to be able to properly taste, because your nose is as involved while you're drinking a whiskey as your tongue is. And it really helped me to be able to expand my tasting ability, because at that point I realized if you got a stuffy nose, if you're drinking out of a glass that doesn't allow the vapors to get to your nose while you're drinking, if when you're nosing, you don't have your mouth open, all of these things will affect the quality of how you taste a whiskey or how you smell a whiskey. So that's really what it became. And so 2 podcasts, and one is me doing whiskey tastings. It's me doing whiskey history. And the other one is me interviewing people, because I'm still learning a lot about whiskey. I've been doing this for 3 years, and it's been very, I have saturated my brain with so much that it's now starting to clear up. And but I still love asking distillers questions and seeing where one distiller's philosophy is versus another, and then looking at whiskey history and seeing how it's evolved over the years. Because I think all of these make whiskey so much more interesting than just being a bottle on your shelf or something you drink on a Saturday night because you want a buzz. So
it's knowing that actual history. In fact, so one of the questions I had written down here for you was, because from my experience, at least, again, I'm very much still a neophyte in this, but whiskey seems to attract stories and myths very quickly and very easily. I've been listening to some of your interviews. I've been listening to some of the whiskey stories, and you can tell it's very easy for a cult of an idea to spring up around something in a whiskey. Why do you think whiskey so easily is lent to this kind of myth making?
I think because so much of it happened during a time period where it wasn't being documented. And because when it's not documented, speculation comes in, and you start to all of a sudden have people coming up with narratives that fit whatever theme they're trying to follow, but it doesn't necessarily ring true. So one good example would be, we think back to the story I did on Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln had a quote where it was in the New York Times, it was in the New York Herald, it was spread across papers across the US, that he had been in consultation with a member of the House of Representatives or some other government official who said, how could you put Ulysses S. Grant in charge of our army? He's a drunkard. And to which Lincoln was said to have replied, well, tell me what brand of whiskey he drinks, and I'll send a barrel to all my other generals. With the idea being, he fights, and I need men who will fight. And if the whiskey is fueling him, then, let's fuel the rest of them. So this is a story that came from a trusted source. It came initially from the New York Herald. It ended up going to the New York Times. Once it got in the New York Times, that was a trusted resource to everybody else. So everybody else trumpeted the same story out. Come to find out, there was a telegraph operator who was curious about that story, who worked in the White House, who wrote about it in his journals, and said, he asked Abraham Lincoln about that quote. And Lincoln said, I wish I'd said it. He said, actually, it's just a paraphrasing of a story about King George the Second and General Wolfe in Canada when he was being discussed as the man to take over the forces in Canada for the British. It was Lord Newcastle that came in and said, "Are you crazy? He's mad." And so King George said, "Well, if he's mad, find the dog to fit him and I'll have him bite all my other generals." And so that's where that story came from. But it's because during that time period, it just, whiskey was evolving. And I don't think the people who were making whiskey at that time, a lot of them were farmer distillers. As the industry started to develop, those were people who were just trying to make money. They didn't see a future where people 100 years from now would be going, "Wow, I wonder what his mash bill was," or "I wonder what equipment he used." Or so what you end up having to do is you have to go back and you have to find references. You have to find receipts. You have to find maybe where, George Washington, his distillery, they kept meticulous records. So you could see not what the mash bill was, but what grains he was purchasing and that sort of thing, or where he was getting his barrels from and that sort of thing. So you can sort of piece it together. But the other piece is that the 19th century was an age of the Victorian era was notorious for ghost stories and the macabre. And so you had a lot of fantasies that grew up around. When you start talking about ghost stories at distilleries, a lot of them originate in the late 1700s into the 1800s. And so I think that is also the reason why a lot of these myths get built up. But to be able to figure out where the name bourbon came from, I mean, you can say easily, yes, it came from the House of Bourbon in France because they were the leading, because they had such an influence over the U.S. Early on. But when I have a Kentucky distillery telling me that the name bourbon came from New Orleans, and I say something about that doesn't ring true to me, and then I go down and find out that the whole story that was concocted was that the reason that the name came from New Orleans was because when they were sending whiskey down on flatboats, it was on the Mississippi, it was aging on the way down. And then once it was being consumed on Bourbon Street, everybody said, "What a fantastic whiskey. Give me that Bourbon Street whiskey." Well, the problem with that story is that bourbon was named in the 1820s or maybe before that, but the first records are 1820. Bourbon Street didn't become anything other than a residential street until the 1860s when an opera house was built. It still remained a residential section until World War II, when the soldiers came in to disembark for Europe. And so they wanted to let loose, and they had moved the party zone back from the shoreline out to Bourbon Street. And so that's when Bourbon Street became. So it's we can say it's not where the name came from. So that leaves the mystery of, again, where did it come from? Because there was a Bourbon County, Kentucky. And so the assumption is that it came from whiskey that was coming from Bourbon County, Kentucky, which was a big county at one time and then now it's just a very small county. So it's just fascinating. But what it does is it lends to speculation. And I've read historians who are very trusted historians who have tried to speculate, and their speculation ends up being printed as fact.
Yeah.
Because it came from a reliable source. And so that's the danger. And I find myself, and that's really the scary part about me doing this, I don't consider myself a whiskey historian. I'm a storyteller, but I want the truth. As much as I can find the truth, I'm going to find the truth. But I will say that I had a episode that I had to go back and rework because I found out that something that I thought was true. Later on, I found a piece of evidence that said, nope, that can't be true. And so I have to go back and I have to revise that episode because I don't want it to be incorrect. If I know it's not right, it needs to be fixed.
In 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, someone goes back, well, Drew said this, which means obviously this must be true because
right.
90% of what he said was accurate. Therefore, and that's how another myth gets started.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's fun and maddening at the same time.
I believe it. Is there a favorite story you have, true or false, to whiskey that you've come across?
My favorite story, actually, I have the bottle over here, not too far away, is Shackleton whiskey.
Yes.
When I went to the store, I was looking for a value scotch. Mm-hmm. And most of the scotches out there are that are blends, are mm-hmm. blends of grain whiskey and then single malts. So, and usually there's a lot of grain whiskey in them. So if you get one that's called a blended malt, then it's made up of single malts that have all been blended together. So you're getting a higher quality in the bottle, or you should be. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to taste better, but you should hope that it would. So, and I had seen Johnny Walker Green, that's a blended malt, and it runs, probably $60, $70 a bottle. Shackleton, you can find somewhere around $35 to $40 a bottle. So I say it's a great entry whiskey. So when I saw it, I went, all right, well, let me buy that. It looks cool. The box is interesting. It's got all this nautical stuff on it.
Yeah.
I don't know what the name Shackleton is. So I'm reading a little bit on the back of the box and I'm going, a polar explorer, blah, blah, blah. Interesting. So when I was starting to work on season 1 of Whiskey Lore, I was going to Scotland. And so I thought this was going to be my second trip to Scotland. And I thought I can do some interviews. And so there were 2 stories I wanted to chase. One was a story about a ghost dog called Kubakin, which was the box basically had this kind of smoky looking outline of a wolf. And so I wanted to learn the story of that because on the back of the box, it talked about this mysterious ghost dog that was haunting this village of Tomatin. And so I planned on that. And I also wanted to go meet Richard Patterson, who was the man who blended this Shackleton whiskey, because the story that I had heard up to that point was that they had basically found a 100-year-old bottle of whiskey buried in the ice in the Antarctic and brought it back, and he had blended to match it. And so I wanted to talk to him about this story. So I go fly over there. I meet with Richard Patterson, who's a 50-year master blender and distiller. He's over the Dalmore and at one time was at Bruichladdich before it was taken over and revived. And then he's with White Mackay. So they make a variety of blends, and one of them is the Shackleton. So when I went, I'm like, okay, first of all, I should be a little nervous because this guy, has quite a stature in the whiskey industry. One thing you'll find about people in the whiskey industry is that they are all very approachable. There are very few people in the whiskey industry that I have come across who I have felt nervous around, because everybody's just very welcoming, and they have a passion, and they want to tell you their passion.
Yeah.
And so Richard had 2 passions. One passion was whiskey. The other passion was Shackleton.
Oh, really?
The man.
Yeah.
When I walked into his office, he had brought out all sorts of memorabilia about Sir Ernest Shackleton. And I'm looking around, and then he's talking about him, and I'm feeling like an idiot. I'm like, this guy sounds like somebody I really should know about, but I have never heard of him before. And so as I did my interview with Richard and then I left, I contacted a friend of mine who lived in Glasgow or near Glasgow. And we were chatting back and forth. And I told him about how nervous I was about this Shackleton story. And he said, "Oh, Shackleton." And I went, I'm talking about a national hero here. If I screw this story up, I am really going to be in trouble. So he said, well, I'll help you out. So we went and we met at a pub in Glasgow before I went home. And he gave me 2 books. And one of the books was was written by the navigator who had documented the entire trip. And the trip is absolutely amazing. It's the most incredible survival story, I think, in the history of man. It basically, do you know the story? Have you heard?
I do. So
Yeah.
we do a books podcast every year. And one of my buddies read the Endurance book for the first time.
Okay.
And so feel free, though, to share the story with anyone that hasn't heard that before.
Yes.
Just the story beats.
So basically, Shackleton had tried 2 times before on his own to get to the South Pole.
Mm-hmm.
The second time he went was on his own. The first time was Robert Falcon, I think, was the explorer that tried to go that he went with the first time on a different mission. And neither time did they make it to the South Pole. So the second time was when they left these cases of whiskey behind in the ice. That was the Nimrod expedition. Then he wanted to, again, lobby the government to let him go and do another journey down to the South Pole. But then suddenly, Raoul Edmondson got there first. And so that was lost. He had no opportunity to do it. Somebody had already conquered the South Pole. So he said, well, my mission is I'm going to go across the South Pole and I'm going to have them meet me on the other side. So we'll do this journey across. Gets the ship together. World War I starts. And now it's all in doubt. Can we go? Can we not go? Winston Churchill had to give him approval to go. He said, your ships are not going to help us out that much. So go ahead and go. Maybe it'll give some people a positive story in the midst of what's going on. Well, positive story turned into a negative story because once they got down to Antarctica, they went in and it was the worst winter, or was it the worst summer? I forget. But anyway, once they got there, what happened was the ice was too far north, but they decided to go in anyway. And when they went in, the ship was crushed and sank. And now they're on Antarctica. Nobody knows where they're at. They are basically drifting on ice, on these ice floes, and they do so for some 400 days. So we're talking about a year plus that they are floating here on the ice and trying to survive and going through all these different disasters. Finally, they get their 3 little lifeboats out to Elephant Island, which is not too far north. And then they decide somebody's got to go for help. So they get this one boat together. They put all the reinforcements in it that they can, because it's going to go through the worst seas on Earth, the most turbulent seas on Earth. They end up having to, Shackleton goes with his navigator and with his carpenter, and they're going off to South Georgia Island, which is in the middle of nowhere. And if the navigator didn't get it right, they could just sail off into the endless Pacific. And so they end up getting there. Their ship falls apart just as they get there. And now they can't get to the side of the island they need to. And South Georgia Island is just a huge set of mountains. And so they are not mountain climbers. They are not prepared to be mountain climbers. And somehow in 36 hours, they crossed over the mountains, surviving even a situation where they reached a cliff and had no idea how they were going to get down this cliff. So they all just tied each other together and slid down the side of this cliff, hoping that they would survive. And other men have tried to do this. Actually, I think it was 2016 that there was a team that went to try to recreate the boat journey all the way to the over and scaling, and they couldn't scale it. They had, I mean, these guys are worn out and tired, and they haven't eaten.
They're starving.
And yet these guys who are equipped, who are modern explorers, can't pull it off. And so they ended up, the people on Elephant Island that were left behind, it took them a while to get back to them, but they all survived.
Yeah.
He didn't lose a single, the worst thing they lost was a toe. One
Which
guy
is amazing.
Lost a toe to frostbite, but that was it. They somehow survived. So it is an absolutely fascinating story. So what I did was I said, I am going to tell the Richard Patterson story I'm going to tell the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton from his birth in Ireland all the way up to the Nimrod expedition. And then I'm going to tease the Endurance episode and then do a whole episode based just on dramatizing that, because I'd seen a movie on it. There's a Kenneth Branagh movie on it, which was I think it was a made for TV movie or something. It's good, but it spends a little bit too much time on the scandals that were going on before he left. And so
the irony of Kenneth Branagh.
Yeah, exactly. And so anyway, I ended up producing these stories, and they have become my most listened to stories. They're the ones that people really, in fact, they found the Endurance, they found the Endurance not too long ago. They were doing deep diving and found the boat. And you won't believe how many emails and messages on Instagram I got. Did you see? I'm like, people know how much I love this story. And so they are into it as well. So, I mean, it's fun to bump into things like that, because these are parts of history that whiskey can teach us that you wouldn't think whiskey would be the source for a great piece of knowledge. But the more I study of whiskey and whiskey history, the more I realize that a lot of our history, especially in the US, but also in Ireland and Scotland, is tied up in things that revolved around whiskey. So it's fascinating.
Aqua Vitae, right? Water of life.
Yes, exactly.
So actually, that does lead to a couple of technical questions that I wanted to ask you, because these are the things that I have questioned for many years, because I think I've taken it for granted, at least in this. I have heard that whiskey is Irish for water of life. Is that true, false? Is this a myth?
It is true, but it's an anglicizing of what was the Irish word.
Okay.
So actually, the Irish word is Ishkabah.
Ishkabah.
Actually, it's Ishkabaha is how they pronounce it in Ireland and Scotland. It's Ishkabah. So Ishkabah is and you have to realize they're two different languages, but they are similar. The Scotch language is Gaelic, and so the pronunciation will be slightly different. And so that's the Ishkabah versus the Gaelic Irish, which is Ishkabaha. And so that is what aqua vitae is the Latin for water of life.
Okay.
And if you go to Scandinavia, water of life is aquavit. And if you go to France, it's eau de vie. So when you start seeing those names in history, the French talking about eau de vie, it was aqua vitae, which is basically not really necessarily whiskey. It is distilling something, which may be grapes, maybe grain. It's really whatever you had on hand. And this is what makes trying to come up with a simple answer to history very difficult, because again, there were no records.
Yeah.
And I am doing a little write-up for a book I'm doing on Irish whiskey right now. And I had read an Irish whiskey historian who was talking about how whiskey got to Ireland by way of Spain. So what had happened was the Moors had brought the alembic still to Spain to make perfumes and that sort of thing. The Franciscan monks took it and started to utilize it there, and then brought it with them in the 1200s into Ireland. That could be true, but if we know things about monks sometimes would share information. So it may be that there was a Scotsman named Michael Scott, of all things, who lived who had studied in Paris and then moved to Italy. And he is the first Northern European to write about distilling.
Okay.
And so, and that section of Italy was pretty thick with distilling. There were some different places that were, whether they're distilling again for perfumes, for medicines, whatever it may be. And it was actually around 500, about 560 AD, that the spreaders of Celtic Christianity, Columba being one of the saints that did this, started spreading up into Scotland and started spreading out across Germany and Italy. And so it's very possible that whiskey, or what became whiskey, was actually brought in much earlier through the network of monks that may have brought it as early as, maybe the 800s, 900s. We don't, there's no way to know, because the first written record of Ishkaba or aquavitae in Ireland is from the Red Book of Ossory, which is in Kilkenny, and it is 1324.
Wow. So
that's the first mention of it. But everything that I've read has said that it likely was either grapes, because the climate was different that before then. It was, I think this is the time of the Little Ice Age. So there was actually cooler temperatures, it was still warmer temperatures at the time. I have to piece these two pieces together, but the climate may have been more available for growing of grapes into Ireland at that time. And so it's possible that they may have been making a rough form of brandy, basically, but adding a lot of herbs and things into it to try to create a better flavor for it. And then more of that happened when grain came along, because grain wasn't going to give a lot of great flavor. And so how can we improve this flavor? Well, let's put in aromatics, herbs, other things that are going to create a much more interesting drink, or soften the drink. And so again, the first note that we have of whiskey actually potentially being close to what we would say whiskey is, or that is specifically grain, is in 1494, when King James ordered 8 balls of malt from a abbey called Lindores Abbey, north of Edinburgh. And so that was a request for them to produce for him aquavitae, and it was aquavitae with grain. So that's why, again, it gets very confusing. And again, they were probably putting aromatics in it. It was probably, and in fact, there's a distillery there now called Lindores Abbey Distillery, because the people who owned the property didn't realize that Scotch whiskey's birthplace possibly was on their plot of land. Yeah. And so they ended up building a distillery. And
the moment you find that out, you build a distillery.
So the first thing they made was aquavitae. So, and the idea of it was to use herbs that may have been found not only there, but because it was a shipping port to France, that they also could use some of the different herbs that they may have found down in France as well, that might have been shipped up during that time. So it's interesting, but that's really, and again, to say that that's where whiskey started. But what happened was Ishkaba or Ishkabaha slowly got shortened, as we humans like to do. We like to shorten the name.
You mean like when we say sup or sus or any other variation of dropping to 3 letters?
Exactly. So, and there's a variety of spellings of how it started to evolve. The best explanation I've heard of it probably was from the Mickle Distillery in Ireland. He said that initially it had an F on the front of it, and Fishkaba or Fishka. So they call it Fishka, and then it became Wishka, and then it became whiskey. And that was just the English variation on it.
Well, so there's a great lecture I once heard on the history of the English language, basically how it's evolved over the years. And the guy even made the point that at one point we pronounced the K. Yeah. It was connect. we have changed and evolved the language drastically over the centuries. So that actually, wow, that makes sense.
So this was one of my fun things. I was digging into the story of the E, because whiskey is spelled with an E.
Yes.
Through a lot of the United States.
Including your material.
Including my material, yes. And I have a reason for that. In some ways, I regret that I did it, but in other ways, I understand why I did it. But whiskey had a lot of different kinds of spellings. But I came to this question because I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and Asheville is on the edge of the Smoky Mountains. And you can drive down Smoky Park Highway in Asheville, and the spelling of Smoky will change every few blocks. It has an E, it doesn't have an E. It has an E, it doesn't have an E. And so I had to dig into that, because I'm like, for me to tell the story of whiskey and where the E came from in terms of whiskey, I need to understand why this word smoky is also spelled differently. Come to find out that Smokey the Bear is the reason we spell smoky with an E, because
of course,
when they came out with this children's character to prevent forest fires, they didn't want to relate him to danger. So they thought by putting an E into Smokey's name, they would soften the idea of fire to being something a little more fun. And what happened is Smokey the Bear became so popular that people saw that spelling over and over and over again until they finally adopted it. And now you see a lot of people, you even see, if you type into a Google Doc, it will change it to have an E in it.
That's true.
And that's incorrect.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So that's why I say there's a lot of connections between whiskey and the rest of the world. It just, and if we can, and that's what I try to do in my episodes, is really try to relate whiskey to the greater world as well. So,
well, there's a book. I wish I gave it to a friend, because at the time I wasn't drinking much in terms of whiskey, scotch, or anything. And I have a buddy that was far more into it. So I got him a book that was like how whiskey made America or something like that. And it's one of those books I've always like had in the back of my mind. I'm like, I need to find that book again, because I'd just be interested to hear what it says, because so much of all of human history has related to fermenting of something or distilling of something. I made a joke to a buddy, a farmer I met. He was raising wine grapes. I'm like, well, if you make something that makes people drunk, you are always guaranteed of having something to sell. It's just the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and a lot of it's wrapped up in taxes.
Yes.
Because whiskey, I don't think a lot of people realize that the reason we have an income tax is because of whiskey.
Yep.
Because prior to Prohibition, our revenue for the government came from two things: tariffs and from whiskey. And when they were talking about Prohibition, well, that's going to take away a lot of tax dollars. So they had to first pass a amendment to be able to create a income tax. And then once they were able to take money out of your pocket, then
it didn't matter if
Prohibition doesn't matter. It's not going to hurt. It's not going to hurt in terms of taxes. What's interesting is nobody questioned after Prohibition was repealed whether we were going to repeal income tax.
You think that would be a really good question to ask?
Exactly, but nobody did. And this is my thing with governments: is you give them something and they say, "Oh, we're just doing this temporarily." No, they're not going to do it temporarily. It'll become permanent. So
I've seen Revenge of the Sith. I know how this works.
Absolutely.
So you teased us with talking about how you did research for your book on Irish whiskey. So you went on that trip. Oh, please tell me about the trip. How did it go? What was the plan? And what was the highlight, if you had to pick one?
Well, the thing is that I like to, I had gone to Scotland and I had the opportunity to do a book on Scotland. I'd been to quite a few distilleries there, but I felt like the whiskey I didn't understand was Irish whiskey. And that was my whole reason for going to Kentucky, was I needed to understand what bourbon was. And to me, Irish whiskey was Jameson and Redbreast and Bushmills. And beyond that, I didn't really have much in terms of a frame of reference. And if we think about Jameson, Jameson is claims to be triple distilled, and it is everybody calls it smooth and says it's an easy drinking whiskey. And I never really got Jameson. To me, Jameson was kind of uninteresting. And sure, if you want to do shots, it's a quick way to get yourself inebriated. But other ton that, I didn't really get Jameson. Redbreast, I wasn't getting either. And it was funny because my friend kept trying to push it on me. And I'm like, no, there's something about this I'm not getting. And it actually was an American distiller, Talnua, which is out of Colorado.
Okay.
Patrick Miller, their distiller, he loves Irish whiskey. He loves a style of Irish whiskey called pot still whiskey. Well, I had never, when I hear pot still whiskey, I think, oh, okay, it's whiskey made in the pot still. What does that mean? And I started questioning that. And so he sent me a bunch of samples, and I started doing a tasting of them without knowing what the process difference was in making pot still whiskey versus making a single malt or anything else, or a blend. And so as I tasted it, I saw that there was commonality, no matter what kind of barrel he put it in, that they were nice, milky whiskeys. They had a nice mouthfeel to them, almost like a creaminess. They all had a very heavy grain note to them, almost like a grape nuts kind of a grain note to them. And then they all had this peppery finish. And I thought, well, this is interesting. So as we started talking in my podcast interview with him, he's like, yes, these are some of the hallmarks of pot still whiskey, and that this is a style of whiskey that was what made Irish whiskey the biggest whiskey in the world in the 19th century, but that all but disappeared except for Redbreast in the 20th century. And in fact, Redbreast disappeared for a while, and Green Spot was the only one. But you had to go to a specific a store in Dublin to get Green Spot. It wasn't available anywhere else. So you had to know where to go get that whiskey if you wanted it. So the style just completely disappeared. And I thought, this is a fascinating whiskey, and I would like to learn more about pot still. So I said, I'm going to shelve the idea of doing the Scotland book. I would love to go back to Scotland, yes, and there are more distilleries to go, but I could probably cover Ireland in a shorter period of time, because at the first glance, there were like 12 distilleries for me to go to. So I planned out my whole trip to Ireland, actually based off of a trip I was going to take to Spain, where I was going to do some more James Bond locations, because one of the Pierce Brosnan movies, World Is Not Enough.
Oh, The World's Not Enough. Classic.
Yes. So you like that
Christmas
movie?
I thought Christmas only came once a year. Terrible joke, but one of my favorites in the entire series.
Yeah, so that's a movie that often gets panned, and I think mostly because of her. I love it because it's kind of a flashback to the Russian, the whole. It feels more spy-ish, and
it does. I think it feels very Fleming-y, very much like Fleming. Even though it's not based on a direct story, it has a lot of those types of elements, even down to the fact that like she has the deformed ear. Right. That's something that Fleming, if you read the books that you said you have, and this is not to go too far down the tangent, but everyone's like, oh, these Bond girls, unrealistic expectations, what women should look like. In the movies, okay, yes, they hire supermodels. In the books, like Honey Rider has a broken nose that she's gorgeous everywhere else, but like your Bond goes, oh my, her face.
Right.
And that's the way he wrote a lot of the characters in the books.
Well, even Bond himself was supposed to be Hoagie Carmichael, who was not an attractive man. He was just a very plain looking, but that's what he wanted Bond to be. Pierce Brosnan is not really.
Pierce Brosnan is a walking coat hanger, is the way I've heard it. Where, like, it doesn't matter what you put on him, he looks perfect. He just has that build, that everything just hangs on him, and you're like, ooh, that's the male frame.
Yeah.
I think Daniel Craig's a more realistic depiction of what Bond would look like, but that's neither here nor there, despite the blonde hair.
Yeah, exactly. And how he got panned for that too.
He got panned for that too. So I'm sorry, we went down a rabbit hole, but you were going to go to Spain.
Yeah, so I was heading to Spain with my sister just for a leisurely vacation to go to some of these different places. And then I was just going to tack Ireland on. So this was planned for April of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So we know what happened to that.
Perfect timing.
Yes. Had to back all my plans out. Then I decided that I would focus locally. So while the pandemic was still making international travel difficult, I went to Tennessee and started working on an idea for a Tennessee book, which will happen sooner or later. But I ended up going back to my thought on Irish whiskey. And I said, you know what? Maybe I just need to go do this as my first trip out of the US again. But as I started doing research, all of a sudden I realized that there weren't just 12 distilleries. I started building out a spreadsheet and I had like 45 distilleries. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I don't know. But then that person inside me that loves to maybe overindulge and really just, if I'm going to learn it, dang it, I'm going to go after it. I said, okay, I'm going to try to squeeze every one of these distilleries in. And so I went ahead and planned out 24 days and rent a car and drive around the island, sometimes 3 distilleries a day, sometimes 2 distilleries a day, just to try to get them all in and but the hard part about this is when I wrote the Kentucky book was a travel guide. And I was like, I don't know if I can write a travel guide on this because a lot of these places, first of all, they're sourcing whiskey. They're going to an outside source to get whiskey that they're aging and selling while they wait for their own spirits to age so that they can become Irish whiskey, because they have to be 3 years old in Ireland to be considered whiskey.
Yeah.
And so I thought, some of these places may not have visitor centers. Some of them may. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to actually write a book that talks about the Irish whiskey industry as something to travel and keep your eye on? That I'll show you where you can travel to, but we could dig in even deeper and say, watch for these, because these will be coming along. And this will give me an opportunity to meet distillers instead of doing tours with tour guides. Yeah. And the distillers will be able to teach me about Irish whiskey and what Irish whiskey is. Because again, my frame of reference was Jameson and Redbreast. And all of a sudden, you showed me your bottle of Writer's Tears, which I love. Writer's Tears comes out of Middleton, which is the same place that Jameson comes out of. So they are both made in the same place.
Yeah, the same place.
But Writer's Tears is so much more interesting to me in terms of its flavor profile. And so I was like, I want to learn about all of these different places. And I want to see if Irish whiskey is doing the same thing that's going on in Tennessee. Tennessee in 2010 had 3 distilleries. It now has over 45 distilleries itself.
Wow.
So this is the explosion of, and that's because they had to get the laws changed in Tennessee.
Oh, yeah.
to be able to do it, because there were only a couple of counties that had legal right where you could set up a distillery. And it's funny, to this day, Jack Daniel's, you can't go into anywhere in Moore County where it's made and order a Jack Daniel's, because it's still against the law. It's the wettest dry county in the world, as they like to say. So, because every drop of Jack Daniel's comes from that one distillery.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this trip, planned it all out. And then there was a little, this was for March, and then there was a little COVID uprising. And I was like, so I went ahead and canceled all my plans, but rebooked them for 2 months later.
Yeah.
And this time I said, they're in stone. I've written in stone because I can't keep jumping in and out of these plans. So I did. And I did my 24 days, and I didn't get to see, yes, I'm driving between each place, but I'm kind of in a rush getting from one place to the next.
I'd imagine.
So I didn't get to see as much of Ireland as I probably would have liked to, or have been able to enjoy what I saw while I was there. But I saw the inside of every one of those distilleries. And what absolutely blew my mind was the diversity of Irish whiskey. Something that we're probably not going to completely experience for another 2 to 3 to 4 years. because that whiskey is still aging. Some of it may come out a little young for the distilleries that need to make some money and they want to pump it out there early. For others, once it gets to 4, 5, 6 years old, it's probably in that sweet spot where it's going to be what they want it to be. And so there are some distilleries like Teeling that have already gotten past that point, and they are putting out their own whiskeys. And I was shocked when I went there because I have bottles of Teeling that when I tasted them, I'm like, it's okay. I mean, it's nothing overly impressive. Then I tasted it while I was there, newer bottles, and I'm like, wow, these are really good. So what I was tasting was whiskey that was pushed out. Likely because, they're
ready to start getting their own stuff into the market.
We want revenue off of what we're aging. Now they have 6, 7, 8-year-old stocks that are helping them to be able to put out the good stuff. So, I was seeing that story. I went to Great Northern Distillery where John Teeling is. He's the man that pretty much in 1987 helped bring whiskey back from being one company. At one time, if you can imagine, the Irish whiskey industry got so bad that there was only one company overseeing all of Irish whiskey.
So I have to ask, because again, I'm young. Maybe the photo doesn't, the camera isn't showing it. I like to think I'm still young. But I always imagine, whiskey, Irish whiskey must just dominate the market. Like that's been just culturally the lexicon I think of from movies, TV shows, et cetera, et cetera. The whiskey is either Irish or Scotch, and that's what it is.
So this
how did it shrink? And then why is it going boom?
This is the amazing thing, is that in 1960, representatives from that one distillery came over to the United States, to New York, to try to promote Irish whiskey as a thing. Because at that time, surveys showed that less than 50% of Americans knew of something called Irish whiskey. Really? It had disappeared that much that nobody here, because they weren't shipping over here. There were all sorts of, there are lots of different things that killed off the Irish whiskey industry. But, and what's fun is, again, as I went from one distillery to the next, I got all sorts of different variations of the story, which brought me home having to do some more research to really dig into how many of these things are just, old wives' tales that I need to dispel, and how many of these things are true. A lot of them will blame Prohibition, which makes sense because during Prohibition, what happened was you had the Irish still sending up to that point, bottles were still a fairly new thing in the whiskey industry. It was expensive up until mass production of bottles started around 1905. So before then, they were still mostly hand blown glass. Some semi-automatic, but for the most part, it was still a expensive and laborious process. So what they did was that they would ship over barrels and they'd have blenders blending the whiskeys that were coming from the distilleries. And sometimes these blends were great. Sometimes those blends would get watered down. Sometimes when you put it in the barrel, you are opening it up to all sorts of mischief.
Yeah.
And then what happened was, once it got to Prohibition, all of a sudden, because Irish whiskey had a good name, Al Capone and all his guys would putting Irish whiskey as the name of whatever they were putting out, whatever rock gut they were putting out. It maybe a drop of it came from Ireland, maybe none of it came from Ireland. There's no telling. So Irish whiskey here got a really bad name, partially because of that. But that was just one piece of it. It was around the 1870s that Irish whiskey was the biggest thing in the world. In fact, in Scotland, they were selling more Irish whiskey than they were selling Scotch.
Wow. Because
Scotch was considered harsh, and you either were getting the harsh stuff from the Highlands, or you were getting the mass-produced grain alcohol that was meant probably more for gin, but that they were aging or adding things to make it seem like it was whiskey. And it was all thanks to the invention of a Irishman named Aeneas Coffey, who came up with the coffee still, which is the continuous still, which is which in the 1870s, the Irish distillers, the big four out of Dublin, said, you know what? That stuff is not whiskey. I don't care what you say, but we are going in pot stills and we are going through all this process, and you're just running it through this thing that looks like a flute. And it's, you're just taking it off at one particular point in the process, and it's just not got a lot of flavor to it. So you're really reliant on a barrel or something else to add flavor to it. And so they got together, they wrote a 100-page book on what whiskey is. And this was John Jameson, Powers, George Rowe Company, and I'm going to forget the fourth one. And so these four distillers are all saying basically, our whiskey is superior, and that stuff should not be called whiskey. In fact, they called it silent spirit.
Wow.
And this is what was being pumped out of the lowlands of Scotland, lots of it. And so, and what set these guys off was that the DCL, which was a corporation that based in Scotland that basically owned a bunch of these column still distilleries, set up a distillery in Dublin called the Phoenix Park Distillery, and that was a shot across the bow. They said they were making fine old Dublin whiskey, and they did put pot stills in there, but just the threat that a column still may show up really set these guys off. Now, the misnomer in all of this, and what you hear people say, is that the reason that Irish whiskey went down was because the Scots were producing it faster and cheaper. And because they were, and the average drinker didn't care about pot still whiskey, they just wanted something to get drunk off of, that's what really started to bring the Irish whiskey industry down. That's not really the case, because by 1900, over 70% of the whiskey coming out of Ireland came out of column stills, not pot stills. So Belfast was big for column stills. And so there was a lot of it coming out of there as well. So that's kind of a misnomer that the column still really, and the fact that Ireland did not embrace the column still was the reason that they fell apart. They did embrace the column still in some places. But in Dublin, they went to calling it Old Dublin whiskey, and they added an E to whiskey to differentiate their product from what they considered to be silent spirit or inferior whiskeys made out in the country. And so that's where the E came from. And then all of a sudden what you found was other distilleries like down in Cork would say, you know what? They're putting that E on there to say that their product is better. Maybe we should throw an E on there too. And so all of a sudden the E started to pick up steam. As the whiskey industry started to collapse, because these guys, again, well, Scotland created one of the biggest problems, which was in 1898, there was a whiskey bubble. And this was wild speculation, and two brothers, Robert and I'm going to forget the other brother's name, Pattison, had basically started speculating with their own whiskey, and they were buying up whiskey, their own stocks, to try to inflate the market. And everybody was buying, like we see, the Great Recession and the rest. With the housing market, it basically became this house of cards that sooner or later was going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And when it did, the DCL came up and bought a ton of distilleries. And as soon as they bought them, they shut them down. The idea was they wanted to control how much whiskey was being put out into the market. And they slowly started creeping into Ireland and either buying up distilleries and shutting them down. And Ireland just all of a sudden, they went through the Easter Rising in 1916. That created a problem. They had a civil war right after that. It's very hard to...
Little details like those things.
Yes. Well, when your biggest markets are America and they're going into prohibition and the British Empire, and you're now at odds with the British Empire, and then all of a sudden, once they came out of prohibition, the first thing they did was they started throwing tariffs on, and that created a trade war with the British Empire, and so they basically just squeezed themselves out of business. And so what happened was, they slowly started consolidating. The ones that had survived all came together into a single company that just ran it from, I think it was, I'm going to forget the dates, but it was basically what happened was they had all of these other little distilleries, and they said, you know what, we're going to build one big distillery in Middleton, and we'll make it state of the art, and we'll make all of our whiskeys from there. And so that is what they did. And it was down to, there was a Bushmills distillery and there was the Middleton distillery, and that was it. And so this myth came up that Irish whiskey is triple distilled and it is spelled with an E and it is smooth. Well, these are all the hallmarks of Jameson. The thing is that Jameson was the first brand that they created. The Irish were never big for creating brands, whereas the Scots had Dewar's and Johnny Walker and all of these other things. The way the law was set up in Ireland, they would the distillers weren't selling their own whiskey; they were giving them to bonders. Bonders were, and that's why you'll see a name on the whiskey, and then underneath it'll say Jameson underneath. John Jameson and Sons, because they were basically taking the whiskey in and then they would bottle it and sell it. And so the distillers had no control over the quality of their own whiskeys. It was Powers actually that came out with gold label in the late 1890s in small bottles to give people a sense of what their whiskey tasted like straight from the distillery, so they could tell whether the whiskeys they were buying from these bonders was legit or wasn't legit. And so the branding was a big piece of it as well that really brought the Irish whiskey industry down. And so when in 1970 or 1968, they decided to take the Jameson name and start to push that as a brand, that's when it started to change. But they set up the rules and defined what Irish whiskey is by that one whiskey. Redbreast was around, but not a lot of people were drinking it. And so pot still was not something that people recognized anymore. And until now, people still don't really have a clue as to what pot still whiskey is and what makes it different.
So why is it that now we all of a sudden are seeing all these distilleries opening in Ireland? Is there a rule change that came up in the country? What's the thing that lit the match?
That is part of what I was trying to find out when I went over there. And really, I think it's just a good economy. If you think about it,
that's a fantastic thing always.
Yes. Irish whiskey, along with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is booming too. I mean, there's over 200 plus distilleries in Germany now. There's 100 distilleries in France. There are, whether they're good distilleries or not good distilleries, that's another question. But the United States has over 2,500 distilleries now. Wow. I mean, a massive amount of distilleries, not all whiskey distilleries. Some are gin distilleries, some are rum distilleries, that sort of thing. But we've had a lot of growth in the economy. And I think what's interesting is that helps spur growth. But I think the whiskey industry actually got an extra boost by COVID because whiskey was something that was essential. So as they were worried, these distillers were worried that things were going to, start to fall for them. They actually ramped up, and secondary market got big, and all of a sudden everybody is really interested in whiskey. So whiskey is in one of those golden ages at this point.
Yeah.
And so there is massive growth everywhere. If you go to Kentucky, when I go back and I do a revision on my book, there will be more distilleries that have shown up since the last time I did my book. I did 32 profiles. There were probably 40 distilleries at that time when I did that book. I know there are more now. And I know that a lot of the distilleries like Buffalo Trace have not been able to keep up with demand. And so they have had a lot of allocation issues. And so they are doubling their capacity to be able to keep up with it. So it is growth across the board. But Irish whiskey has had a little bit more growth than everybody else. And in fact, they talk about in Ireland right now that they believe that by the end of this decade, Irish whiskey will be bigger than Scotch, which I find to be a very bold claim.
That's a very bold claim.
But at its current growth trajectory, and the fact that you have this many new distilleries coming online, and the fact that they say that basically they see Ireland doing to Scotland what Scotland did to Ireland back in the 19th century, that Scotch is Scotch. Yeah, they say we're Scotch, and we're the best in the world, and so we don't need to innovate. And Ireland is saying, no, we are all about innovation, and we're going to do some really interesting things. I don't know if I entirely agree with that. I will say that it will work for a while. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with if we go into a recession, because that means growth is going to slow.
Yeah, that'll stagnate things.
And what usually tends to happen is that you start to have some of the smaller players that aren't that serious start to fall away because they just can't sell anything. So it'll be interesting to see. There's a lot of variables that could cause this growth to kind of tail off and maybe go to sustain for a while. But the creativity is definitely there. I will say, though, that when you're in Ireland or when you're in Scotland, you're always going to get the local opinion, not the global opinion. And this is part of the reason that I am a staunch advocate of finding bourbon that's not from Kentucky, for finding whiskeys other than Scotch. Because if you get into that singular mindset, you get too shallow a view.
Yep.
And it's one of those things that I learned from traveling, is that when you live in your own country and you don't go to other countries, you have a very narrow view of what the world is.
Yes.
And once you get out of your comfort zone and you go to these different places, you start to realize that you're not right about everything. And that's what I think bourbon drinkers will find when they start tasting bourbons from other places besides Kentucky. I think that's what you're going to find when Scotch drinkers try some Irish whiskey. And I think that's what Irish whiskey drinkers will discover if they give Scotch a chance, because I think there's more diversity in Scotch than they give credit for. There's a lot of change going on in the Scotch whiskey industry as well. So it's just something that for the whiskey fan, it's fantastic because it gives us a ton of choice. And but Jameson is the one that came out. And actually, this is what's funny, is while I was doing my tours, I went to Middleton. I was really looking forward to that trip. I did the behind the scenes tour because I wanted to get as much information as I possibly could.
Yeah.
And I heard some really bad statements that just are so blatantly untrue, but that this is the largest distillery in the country. And so if you're going to Ireland, one of the stops you're probably going to make is to Jameson on Bow Street or the one at Middleton. And so if they're telling the story at both, it kind of turns my stomach a bit, because basically they say the Irish triple distill, the Scots double distill, and the American single distill. Well, that's absolutely false, because not all Irish distillers triple distill. And so I met a lot of them that double distill. I went to Scotland and I went to Auchentoshan. Auchentoshan triple distills. They're a Scotch distillery. The other thing they said was that all Scotch is peated or is smoky, which is not true.
No.
And to say that American whiskey is single distilled is to say, oh, well, all American whiskey runs through a column still. And that is not true. We have triple distilled whiskeys here. We have double distilled whiskeys here. So they're trying to put pat answers on things. And unfortunately, that is, again, when you have been the leader and the only company for the long, you write the narrative and you tell the story of Irish whiskey. But Irish whiskey is now becoming pot still whiskey again. There's a lot of distilleries that are doing that. On the West Coast, a lot of them are going back to peating their whiskeys because they want that smoky character, because that's traditional. Mm-hmm. That's the way it was done before coal was widely available or was available throughout Ireland. It's like you heated and malted your barley with whatever fuel source you had.
Yeah.
And so if you had this, what they call turf, and that's what's interesting too, is that in Ireland, they call it turf. It's called peat in Scotland. If you take this turf and you are smoking it, it's going to impart some really unique characters that you're basically burning thousands of years of dirt.
Yes.
Is what you're doing, and vegetation. And so it's going to add another whole character to a whiskey. And so when you have these distillers who are trying to recreate old mash bills, because there's a project right now where they have gone back and found a mash bill from the 1820s, and they have mash bills from the early 1900s, and they're trying to recreate these. You can never recreate them 100%, because what you're forgetting is that they had different ways of maturing whiskey back then. It wasn't until 1915 that the 3-year age requirement came about in Ireland. So before then, they could have put it into a barrel for an hour and brought it out and called it a whiskey. And to tame it down, they could have thrown other stuff in it to try to, because there weren't any purity rules at that point. So this is what we forget. So you can, and the other thing that I've discovered in tasting whiskeys, I actually had an opportunity to taste 2 whiskeys, historic whiskeys, while I was there.
Oh,
one, this will, I haven't told anybody this yet, and I will show a picture of the bottle on my Instagram at some point. While I was at Great Northern Distillery, John Teeling's distillery, I was talking to their distiller, who's Brian Watts, who's a Scotsman, and as we were chatting back and forth, he saw my love of whiskey history, and he said, "I got to show you this bottle." So he goes over and he pulls over this deformed brown bottle. And he said, "We found this under a barn in Tyrone, Ireland, in Northern Ireland. And we had it tested, and it was whiskey. And so we took the whiskey out of this bottle and we put it into another bottle. Here, have a taste. This whiskey, we had the bottle dated. The bottle was made in the 1880s. Oh. So he gives me a chance to taste this. And it is the most fascinating. The whiskey evolved as it was on my palate so dramatically. It was like all these impactful flavors, and they all hit at the speed of light. And I'm like, what the heck was that? And nosing it, it just was, it didn't smell like anything I had ever smelled before. And I had the same thing go on with whiskey that I tried while I was in, I went to California, and they had found this big store of pre-prohibition whiskey. Ooh. And so I got a chance to bring a couple of bottles of it back with me. And when you taste it, it tastes different from any bourbon that's made now. It was made in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. It was shipped and aged in California. So it's a very unique whiskey, but it was one of those that when you taste it, you're like, I can't relate this to any whiskey that I have had, which mm-hmm. tells me that the barrels that they were using, where they were getting the wood from, this was, pollution differences, whatever it may have been, mm-hmm. All of these things you have to take into account, elements in this natural product, that how each of those elements can make a whiskey different. And I went to the Waterford Distillery, which is a fascinating place. The Mark Rainier from Bruichladdich came down and bought this Irish distillery with the sole goal of buying barley from different farms across the country, distilling them separately to see if barley tasted different from different areas of the country. And I got to taste these whiskeys, these new makes is what they call them, unaged, and got an opportunity to taste different farms. And they all used barley.
Mm-hmm.
They were all so dramatically different. They all had different elements to them. And it helped me see that, where it's coming from, all of these different natural elements change the flavor of your whiskey. And so the idea that somehow in the 21st century, we're going to be able to recreate a 19th century whiskey is impossible. There's no way, because they drank for a different reason back then. And there were different elements that went into making a whiskey. So that was, like I say, there were some really amazing things that I did while I was over there. And the Waterford was one of my favorites. Tasting the 1800s whiskey was absolutely amazing, but also getting a chance to go see some of the smaller distillers, like Killowen is a distillery that you may start seeing little bottles showing up on American shelves. He's basically, when I showed up, you drive down this single track road that you're praying that nobody comes from the other direction, because there's nowhere to pull off. So you're going to have to back up a mile to get out of there. And then he's basically in a shack. And when I met him, he was malting oats for making whiskey. And we've heard of using wheat in whiskey. We've heard of using rye in whiskey. We've heard of malted barley in whiskey and unmalted barley in whiskey. But oats, I mean, there's not a lot of people that use oats, but they've done this historical research and realized that oats were a big part of Irish whiskey at one time, that a lot of the mash bills had up to 30% oats in them. So he was malting them. And I'm like, I didn't even know that was a thing. But he had his little smoker going on, and he was doing that. And then he had these little Portuguese stills that he was doing his distillation off of, just doing it old school. And I thought, this is absolutely fascinating, because, he is trying to recreate the past as best he can. But you have these ultra modern distilleries that are trying to create something that's cutting edge. And you have other distilleries that are trying to go into using peat. You have some double distilling, you got some triple distilling. And all of these things have different impacts on a whiskey. Some are going back and finding types of barley that haven't grown in Ireland for 100 years, that they've gone and sourced these seeds and have planted them and started to grow these crops, so that they can. The reason they died out is because they weren't efficient. They couldn't get enough yield out of them. And so when you have a multinational like Jameson's,
they're gonna go for the highest yielding whatever they can get the most amount of.
It becomes an accountant decision, not a distiller.
It's not an artisan decision.
Right. And so all of these just died out. Or in terms of being grown. And so that's one of the things that Waterford is doing, is they're going back and they are growing. They have these farmers who are growing these old grains. And while I was there, he was going through the first run of one of these heritage grains. And he's like, I'll keep talking to you through this, but I also have to keep paying attention to this, because this stuff is really hard to work with. And then we need to make sure that this run comes through successfully. And so it's amazing, because I had just actually not too long before gone to Jack Daniel's, and Jack Daniel's was making an American single malt as part of a blend that they are making, but they're running it off a column still, and column stills are notoriously one-dimensional in terms of their flavor. And so when I asked him, what is this going to taste like? He said, well, it just tastes like buttered biscuits, basically.
How very Southern.
I thought, well, yeah, that doesn't really sound like what I experienced in terms of barley when I was in Scotland, because I tasted new make there, and it was very diverse in terms of its flavors. And he said, no, it's just very one-dimensional. And I said, well, that's because you're going through a column still. And he said, you can't get more perfect than a column still. And he's right. You can't. You're getting a exact cut off of that still. But while I was at Waterford, at the beginning of this distillation run, he said, here, we'll take a sample. So we sampled it. I gave him my flavor notes off of it. He said right now it's at about 71% alcohol. We'll walk away. I'll show you some stuff. We'll come back and it'll start to drop and we'll be at a lower ABV because as the run goes on, the alcohol gets lower and lower and lower. So when we came back a while later, he gave me another sample, tasted completely different. It went from being a fruity spirit to being a very grainy spirit.
Really?
And it set the light off in my head. A column still, you basically are saying, I'm taking it at a certain percent.
Yep.
And the distillers in Ireland taught me that the very beginning of the run, the reason that a lot of these guys don't automate the process is because there is a point at the very beginning of the run where a lot of your flavor, your fruitiness will come in, and you need to grab that and put it into the stuff that you're going to be turning into whiskey. The heads, the first part you're throwing out or redistilling because it's basically acetone and all those poisons. And the stuff at the end is just kind of the funky stuff that you want a little bit of it, but because it gives personality, but not too much of it. So you're trying to get this heart's cut where in Scotland, you're getting it, if I'm demonstrating a foot wide. Mm-hmm. Whereas basically when we were tasting it off that still, we were tasting it at one mark within that. Think about how much flavor you're losing all the way around that. And especially if you're coming off a column still, you're saying, I just want 71%. I don't want 69% or 68%. So all those flavor notes that are in those areas, we're just ignoring those. We just want this one-dimensional flavor note to come out of this spirit. So when you start seeing Jim Beam and Jack Daniels, if they come out, because both of them are working on them, mm-hmm. if you see them come out with American single malts, make sure that they are finished in something, because if they aren't, it's just going to be a very one-dimensional alcohol. But if they put them in sherry barrels or something that is rum barrels or something that's going to give them some kind of a personality, that's really the only way I see that those products are going to be successful. So
I've definitely learned that I like when it has a sherry finish so far. Of like the whiskeys that I purchased that I'm like, these are the ones I enjoy more. They tend to be aged in the sherry barrels at some point.
So do you go for when you go for scotches, what's your go-to?
My go-to is Glenlivet, and I could be pronouncing it wrong, but it is what it is. It's
Glenlivet. Yep.
Okay. Glenlivet. I like that one. That's probably my go-to consumer. Just it works. It's the right price point and I enjoy it. I can drink it on the rocks or on neat and I'm happy either way. Then Dalwhinnie is currently like if that's the one that I sit down, I put just a little bit in and I just sit there and gracefully sip and go, oh, these notes of vanilla are amazing.
Nice. So Dalwhinnie was probably my first favorite. But what's interesting is the more you drink, the more you will start to crave other things.
Yes.
And so that my journey has gone from drinking things. I would never buy an expensive whiskey because I didn't want to waste my money on it. And I didn't, if somebody offered me one, I would turn it down because I said, it's lost on my palate. I'm not ready for that yet. Mm-hmm. To me, you should have a certain respect for a whiskey. I mean, because a distiller has put time in. If it's sat in a barrel for ages, that's time that had to mature and get to where it was
an investment.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a craft to that, and being able to pull something out at a point where it's pleasing. And so to me, I don't want to waste that talent on a weak palate. So I started with the stuff that was probably milder and then slowly worked my way up until I shocked myself with peat and I hated it at first. And then I learned how to like it the same way I learned how to like Redbreast. And now all of a sudden I love it. In fact, peated whiskey is my favorite kind of whiskey. I love a smoky whiskey.
So have you tried the Nick Offerman special of Lagavulin yet?
I had the Guinness cask finished one, which I thought I was going to be blown away by. And I was like, it's, I get the Guinness, but I'm just not, it didn't blow me away.
It was just a buddy of mine got it, and it's very smoky, very, very smoky, and very peaty. And I was not prepared for that yet. I'm like, I told him in advance, I'm like, I know my taste. So let's put very little in there. And I nursed it a little bit. Drew, we could go on for a very long time. So this has been a delightful conversation, but where could people go to learn more about you, your work, and your books, both the one on Kentucky and the one you've got coming out in Ireland?
So you can get them on Amazon. So they're available at some booksellers, but more so on Amazon. And actually, I think it's on sale right now, around $17 a book. So that's good. So just look for Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon, or if that's too long for you, just type in Whiskey Lore and that book will come up.
With an E.
With an E, yes. And the only reason I did the E in Whiskey Lore was because I'm an American-based podcast. So I figured SEO, I got to make sure that people can find me. So not thinking Google is smart enough to figure out that whiskey is spelled two different ways, although they do spell smoky wrong. But anyway, that all of my Instagram, Facebook, and all those are /Whiskey Lore. And whiskey-lore.com is where you can find the podcast. The podcast, again, just look for Whiskey Lore. There's Stories, which is the one where I tell the stories. And then there's Interviews, where I actually interview people and let them tell the stories. So, or teach you about different styles of whiskey. So those are the best places.
Drew, thank you again so much for coming on the show today. It has been delightful.
Terrence, thank you. I appreciate you inviting me on. And you wear the tie well.
Thank you. Big thanks to Drew for coming on the show today. It was an absolute blast to talk to him. You can learn more about Whiskey Lore and Drew's work by going to whiskey-lore.com and by searching Whiskey Lore on all the socials. We've got all that stuff linked in the show notes. You can also find Drew's book by searching Whiskey Lore on Amazon. Until next time, this has been Terrence Lehue and the Suit Up Podcast wishing you a very happy Suit Up Sunday.